Hi, in this video we're going to go over the Sumerian language, just an introduction, and then we'll jump into the more particulars of the grammar, phonology, things like that in later videos. Um, and so this will be a relatively brief video. But first of all, what is Sumerian? So it's a lot of things. First of all, it's a linguistic isolate, and this is pretty interesting on its own. A linguistic isolate is a language that does not have a known relationship to any other language. Known and demonstrated, we should say. So, for example, other languages spoken in the area, Akkadian, for example, Akkadian isn't spoken nowadays, but it's known to be related to and has demonstrable links to languages like, for example, Hebrew and Arabic and things like that that are used nowadays and that we know about nowadays. Sumerian doesn't have a link. There are lots of proposed links that would take it out of this category of being a linguistic isolate, but it is currently considered an isolate. So that's a little bit of an air of mystery for it. It's a language that was spoken in the Fertile Crescent, so you can think Mesopotamia, modern day areas like Iraq and Iran. And we don't know how long specifically exactly it was spoken. It was probably spoken for a little while before it was written, but it was written at least 3000 BC, around that time. And it's the predecessor of Akkadian in the Near East. So we mentioned Akkadian. Akkadian is a language that was spoken in the Babylon area, but before Akkadian was spoken widely in that area, the classical language of the area, or the common language of the area, was Sumerian. And because it has a sort of first language in the area status, it became the classical language of the Babylonians. Much in the same way that we think of Latin as a classical language. We read texts that were written 2,000 years ago in Latin. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, even though they would have spoken different languages, they did read texts written in Sumerian. So why would you want to learn it or study it? So first of all, it is one of the first written languages, which is cool and interesting in and of itself. It gives you a window into the mind of people who existed before any other people that we can, whose words we can read firsthand. It's in the running with ancient Egyptian. We're not all exactly sure when ancient Egyptian was first written. We're fairly certain when the first records we have from ancient, or that are written in ancient Egyptian, are from. But there is some debate as to whether there are, or we should expect to find, older records. Also, it's the language of literature of ancient Mesopotamia. So if you're interested in ancient literature of any sort, Sumerian is a great place to start because it's as far back as you can go in ancient Mesopotamia. It's also the language, as a subset of that, of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of, I think, the great epic pieces of literature ever written, one of the greatest ones. Put it right up there with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And although you can read translations, learning Sumerian to have a better understanding of the Epic of Gilgamesh or the surrounding culture, I think it's a great way to have a better understanding. So some interesting things to know about Sumerian as a language. Now, first of all, a lot of people are really interested in the writing system of Sumerian. It has quite a different look to it than a lot of the writing systems of other ancient languages we're used to, like Latin and Greek, which were written on papyri, or ancient Egyptian, which was very often carved into stone. Obviously, there are other languages, runic scripts carved into stone. Ancient Egyptian could be written on papyri or carved into stone. I should be a little bit more clear, I guess, but it is ancient Sumerian, or Sumerian was written in cuneiform. So the word cuneiform or cuneiform is, I guess, how people generally say it. It means essentially wedge shapes or wedge writing. So wedge-shaped styluses, or styli, I guess, were used to make imprints into clay tablets. This is not totally uncommon in the ancient world. Often you saw a stylus used to write in wax, and in other Near Eastern cultures, you would see a stylus used to write in clay tablets. But it is different from a lot of the sorts of writing that we're often used to seeing. And it affects the appearance of it because there are only so many shapes you can easily and reasonably make with a wedge-shaped stylus in clay. You can see over here in this picture, it's quite an attractive, beautiful writing system. And in this picture, we have a lot of lines to sort of segment things off. And you don't always see the writing organized in quite this way. But you do see it's quite an attractive writing system. And also, being written in clay, it's much more likely to persist than some media seen in ancient times. For example, papyri could be destroyed quite easily. Obviously, things written in stone would stick around, and papyri that were taken care of can stick around for quite a while. But that was where the writing system originally sort of got its look from. It was then also used in other media like stone as well, but the characteristic appearance is from its original use in clay. Most of the glyphs that you'll see in cuneiform were originally pictographic, which means that first they represented physical objects in the real world. This is sort of intuitive. We often think of sort of picture writing as being this primitive. I have a cow, so I'll draw a cow, almost cave painting. It didn't stay like this for long, but it's important and interesting to understand why it was this way. Originally, it appears that one of the main usages of writing was in keeping track of property. So a picture of a cow might be impressed onto a little sort of token of clay and could be used for counting cattle and keeping track of how many cattle are bought and sold or how many cattle an individual has. So it would be quite a handy system. That system was then later applied to a more linguistic usage, so a usage that required the representing of full words and sentences. As that happened, the language quickly became ideographic. So when we wanted to not just represent things like cows, but say we wanted to represent ideas like warmth or coldness, we could create glyphs or sort of pictures that represented an idea rather than a physical object. And later, syllabic. So, for example, in English, we have the syllable be. We use it in words like because or the word be. You could draw a bee, pictographic, to represent the word bee, like a bee that buzzes, and then also use it as the syllable be in because. An example of something ideographic would be, for example, we use a dollar sign, although a dollar, not talking about a dollar bill, a dollar is sort of an abstract concept. We use a dollar sign to represent it. Also, a percent sign is a great idea. It's an idea without a physical manifestation. So we use an ideograph in that circumstance. A lot of languages use syllabographic writing in modern times. Amharic and Japanese are two pretty classic examples of this. And so this isn't what we might be tempted to think of as sort of a primitive way of writing. It's quite advanced. And Sumerian advanced to the stage of writing fairly quickly. The writing system itself shows remarkable evolution over a period of 3,000 years. So it was essentially used in different capacities over a very long period of time. And there are early stages where we can see very clearly sort of the pictographs in writing. This might surprise you, but this is about as clearly as you'll be able to see pictographs in Sumerian writing. Sorry. But at later times, these symbols become more abstract to where what they originally pictographically or ideographically represented is not very clear when you're just reading the text. So keep that in mind, that learning Sumerian involves understanding quite an abundance and sort of evolution of different signs as they've changed over a very long period of time. A longer period of time than from now to the archaic Greek period, before Greek was even commonly written in a standardized alphabet. So it's quite an old language. As far as stages of the language, we're not going to spend too much time over this. We've got some commonly sort of expressed stages of the language: Archaic Sumerian, Older Classical Sumerian, Neo-Sumerian, Late Sumerian, and Post-Sumerian. Sometimes Late Sumerian and Post-Sumerian are sort of wrapped up into one. The basic trend you want to understand here is Archaic Sumerian. This is sort of the oldest Sumerian. First, we see sort of easily identifiable pictographs that haven't sort of morphed into more abstract forms. And before that, we see actually an absence of whole words even being written, more just symbolic and pictographic writing. Then we move towards more, well, by Old and Classical Sumerian, we're having full sentences and full linguistic units being represented. But we move towards the actual writing system looking more abstracted. By the time we get to Late and Post-Sumerian, we're not exactly sure when this happened, but Sumerian stopped being spoken as a native language by people, and so it was more of a liturgical language used for religious purposes. So it was still, for quite a while, really until after Alexander the Great, it was still used by the Babylonians and the people of the Near East, but it wasn't spoken in the same sense that we think of. It wasn't spoken like at home by people. It wasn't learned by children. It was learned by non-native speakers to be used for religious and political purposes. It's also quite interesting to talk about the dialects of Sumerian. You can divide the dialects into sort of the time that the language was written, like we talked about, archaic, classical sort of periods like that. But Sumerian also had this interesting sort of division between dialects, the Emegir and the Emesal dialects. So Emegir being sort of more what we might think of as the default variety, and Emesal, which was used in certain liturgical texts and exclusively by female characters in certain texts, to represent the speech of female characters in certain texts. So it represents kind of an interesting split between. It might represent an interesting split between male and female speech, dialectally. So two dialects that existed in the same societies, but a certain way that female speakers spoke, a certain way that male speakers spoke. It also might not. We're not really sure. There is precedence for this idea of one community of speakers having extreme dimorphism between the sexes. For example, in Garifuna, this is the case. And Garifuna is a language that's still spoken and can be studied nowadays. So that is something we know happens, but it's not necessarily clear that we understand all the implications of this distinction between dialectal usages. although there's some vocabulary difference between Emigir and Emisal, um, it's also a lot of the differences are phonological, so different sounds are used and substituted in Emisal. So it's kind of, it represents almost certainly a very interesting social dynamic in the period of time that Sumerian was written, but it's not necessarily something that we really easily and well understand. As a linguistic isolate, it has a lot of proposed links to other languages. I haven't put all of the proposals here, but I've just put some interesting ones. We've got the Dravidian languages that are spoken in the southern area of India, so they're not Indo-European languages like in northern India. It's quite an interesting idea. Certainly, Sumerian and certain languages or certain areas of India are not far enough away to where this is totally improbable. Modern Basque, which is spoken in certain regions of Spain, essentially. Sino-Tibetan languages like Chinese. This is an interesting one because Chinese has been recorded for quite a long period of time, so it would be much easier to test this than maybe some other languages that don't have as long a history of being recorded. And then Dene Caucasian languages. So Dene languages would include Navajo, and Caucasian languages would include Georgian, spoken in modern Georgia, south of modern-day Russia, sort of in the broad area that we're talking about, the broad area of ancient Mesopotamia. It's very close physically, the Caucasian languages like Georgian, although the Dene languages are not. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure that there's tons of support for this one. But here's the point is, why is there such broad guessing here about the origins of Sumerian? And it's because it was spoken so long ago. It's really, really tough to find systematic similarities between Sumerian and modern languages. And it could be the direct ancestor of, or directly related in some other way to any of these or some other language. It's just the isolation of it in terms of time, the fact that it was spoken 5,000 years ago, thousands of years before a lot of other languages were even written, makes it very, very hard to prove or show very convincingly a link between it and other languages. And there's also quite a bit of controversy as to who the Sumerians are, which makes the language, I think, quite a bit more interesting to study, because we don't really know ethnically or culturally all that much about them or who they're related to in the modern world. We're not going to go over too much of the grammar, just enough to sort of whet your appetite. But Sumerian grammatically is quite an interesting language. It has ergative, absolutive alignment. So you can go look up more about this if you want, but very generally, some languages like English have nominative accusative alignment, which means all subjects of all verbs have the same marking, essentially, whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. In other words, whether it has a direct object or not, we mark our subjects of verbs the same way. In Sumerian, things are a little bit different, where subjects of transitive verbs are treated one way, whereas there's a different way, absolutive case marking, for the objects of transitive verbs or the subjects of intransitive verbs. This is really interesting, and it sort of seems to have baffled early scholars of Sumerian who tried to fit Sumerian into a nominative accusative alignment. But it is quite an interesting phenomenon. There are modern languages that act this way, so it's not something that is groundbreaking necessarily, but it is quite an interesting phenomenon. It's also agglutinating, which means it forms long words based off of the arrangement of a lot of smaller parts. In English, we don't use a lot of different morphological marking for any one word, and when we do, we sometimes sort of fuse. For example, the marker of plural and the marker of possession in English, we sort of shove those into the same sounds. But Sumerian wasn't that way, so you see very long, very long chains of suffixes and prefixes on Sumerian words. It marks case, so ergative, absolutive, but also genitive, so it marks whether a noun is being used for possession, or dative, whether it's the recipient of or direction towards something towards which an action is occurring, and we'll go over that a little bit more later. It marks number for singular and plural, and aspectual distinctions on verbs like doing something versus did something. I was doing something versus I did it. That would be an aspectual distinction. And interestingly enough, it is highly debated. The grammar, ideas on the grammar have changed a lot over time as we've seen more text and learned a little bit more. But also, pretty much anything you can say about Sumerian is debated by somebody. We're not all exactly on the same page with Sumerian grammar. And that's interesting. It makes it an interesting thing sort of to get into, to be sort of part of the debate and to watch as we learn more about Sumerian. If you were to just read a book about Sumerian, or just read a translation of a Sumerian text, you might miss the fact that a lot of the current practice in translation and understanding of the language is in flux, and traditionally has been too. So an older translation might be sort of translated in quite a different way nowadays. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a sample text. I got this from the Wikipedia page on Sumerian, but there are lots of books that you could go find and read texts translated from Sumerian into English, and just to sort of whet your appetite. Enlil, king of all the lands, father of all the gods, by his firm command fixed the border between Ningirsu and Shara. Mesilim, king of Kish, at the command of Ishtaran, measured the field and set up a stele there. Ush, ruler of Umma, acted unspeakably. He ripped out that stele and marched toward the plain of Lagash. Ningirsu, warrior of Enlil, at his just command, made war with Umma. At Enlil's command, he threw up great battle. He threw his great battle net over it and heaped up burial mounds for it on the plain. Yannatum, ruler of Lagash, uncle of Entemena, ruler of Lagash, fixed the border of Enakale, ruler of Umma. So that's all I have prepared right now for this sort of video and lecture. In later videos, we're going to dive more into the grammar, how cuneiform works, easy ways to remember, ideograms, and pictograms and things like that. And we're going to actually hopefully read some actual texts in Sumerian in these videos and do some longer lectures. But for now, this is sort of where we're going to end. I got a lot of my material from Wikipedia, including images. The one image I used of the Sumerian writing is in the public domain in areas with a life of the author plus 70 years public domain rule or law. And so you can go find those sources and look up more if you would like. Like I said, this text was also from Wikipedia.